The frontier never made room for kindness. Out there, under the weight of the sun and the silence of open land, a man's worth was measured in bullets, not mercy. So when Eli Mercer, a solitary rancher with more cattle than friends, rode into town with a girl barely breathing across his saddle, folks didn't see a hero. They saw a fool. The girl was a runaway. That much was clear. Skin like river stone, wrist scarred by iron, eyes that had forgotten how to hope. He said she needed help. They said she needed to be returned. But Eli didn't ask for their opinion. He just rode on. They mocked him, of course. Laughed at the idea that a man would risk his land, his name, his life for someone the world had already discarded. What's she to you? They jeered. You planning on savant him all? Eli never answered. He just patched her wounds, fed her broth, and kept watch through the nights. Not for thanks, not for glory, but because something deep in his bones told him this girl mattered, even if the law said otherwise, even if the town looked away, even if standing beside her meant standing alone. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that this girl didn't come from nowhere. She came from strength, from a people scattered but not broken, quiet but not blind. Word of her survival spread across the canyons, carried by whisper and wind. And soon, her tribe came not with vengeance, but with gratitude. They didn't bring rifles. They brought stone, cedar, and hands calloused by generations. And as the townsfolk watched in silence, they built Eli Mercer a house, one post, one beam, one nail at a time. It was no ordinary house. It was a message, a monument, a promise carved into wood and earth that said, "You didn't look away. So now, you'll never stand alone again." The same man who was once mocked became the man others began to follow, not for power, but for principle. Because in a world that tried to bury grace beneath dust and greed, Eli had chosen to do the impossible, to be good without permission. This is not just a story of rescue. It's a story of redemption, of reverence, and of what happens when a man dares to protect what others are too afraid to see. A story where one act of defiance became the foundation for something greater than any law. A legacy built not with guns, but with courage. Eli Mercer had never been one for crowds. His land stretched for miles, kissed by sun and silence, bordered by no fences and few friendships. He spoke little, worked hard, and trusted no man who smiled too wide. But the day he found the girl, half-starved, chained to a fallen wagon near the dry creek, something inside him shifted. Her name was Luma. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She just looked at him like she was already gone. And in that silence, Eli saw something that cracked through his own quiet sorrow. A life not yet lost, if someone dared to claim it. He carried her back over rough country, every bump and jolt cutting into his conscience. When they reached his ranch, he laid her on his own bed, gave her water, then sat by the fire and waited, for the fever to break, for the tremble in her hands to slow, for the questions to stop burning holes in his mind. Who would chain a girl like that and leave her die? And why had no one gone looking? He didn't have answers, but he had wood for the stove, stew on the fire, and time. And sometimes, in the West, that was enough to start a resurrection. The townsfolk noticed right away. Eli had once been invisible, but not anymore. They saw the smoke from his chimney, saw Luma gather water from the well, and soon came the whispers. That girl don't belong to him. She's trouble. He's protecting what ain't his to keep. The sheriff visited once, tipped his hat, asked a few pointed questions. Eli answered with silence. The sheriff left with a frown and didn't come back, because there was something in Eli's eyes, something that said, "I've seen war, and I won't let this be one more casualty." Luma spoke slowly, softly, and only when she needed to. Her voice was quiet, but her presence filled the ranch like sunrise, gradually, then all at once. She helped tend the cattle, mended his shirts, carved symbols into the beams of his porch when she thought he wasn't looking. One day, Eli asked her what they meant. "Protection," she said. "For you." It was the first time he felt his hand shake since the war, because no one had ever tried to protect him. Not until a girl the world tried to forget turned his house into something holy. The land, once silent, began to sing again. Coyotes howled nearer at night. The wind moved through the grass with purpose, and the stars, which Eli had once stared at without meaning, now looked like promises. Still, the town laughed, called him the fool rancher, said he'd gone soft. But Eli didn't care, because he knew what they didn't. Kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing a man can carry when everything else has been stripped away. And in saving Luma, maybe, just maybe, he was learning how to save himself. The turning point came quietly, on a morning so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. A shadow moved along the horizon, just past the fence line. Not a rider, not a lawman, but a figure cloaked in red cloth, walking with steady, deliberate steps. Eli reached for his rifle, but didn't lift it. Something in the way the stranger approached, head bowed, hands visible, told him this wasn't a threat. Luma stepped out from the cabin and froze. Her lips parted, her eyes filled with something Eli hadn't seen in her before, recognition. And then, without a word, she ran toward the figure. It was her brother. He spoke in a language Eli didn't understand, words sharp like wind through pine. Luma wept, not from fear, but from relief. And when she turned back to Eli, there was fire in her eyes. "He found me," she said. "They're coming." Eli didn't ask who. He didn't need to, because when the wind shifted and carried the scent of cedar and smoke, he knew her people were near. Not to take her back, not to punish him, but to see for themselves the man who had sheltered their blood when no one else would. Within days they arrived, one by one, then in groups. No wagons, no banners, just bare feet and quiet reverence. The townsfolk watched from a distance, confused and wary. But the tribe never stepped into the town. They came only to Eli's ranch. They spoke little, observed much. One elder placed a hand on Eli's shoulder and said, "You did not take her. You gave her breath." Eli, a man who had never cried in front of another soul, turned away before his eyes could betray him. They didn't bring gold. They didn't bring cattle. What they brought was something the West had long forgotten: respect. They worked alongside Eli, cutting logs, smoothing stone, singing in rhythms older than the town itself. They built not a barn, not a shed, but a house, bigger than Eli's, sturdier, beautiful. They carved symbols into the beams, buried herbs beneath the threshold, and painted patterns on the door that glowed under moonlight. It wasn't a gift. It was a covenant. When it was done, the tribe stood back as Luma walked with Eli to the threshold. "This is yours," she said, "because you never asked for anything, and still gave me everything." The house was more than wood and stone. It was a truth made solid, a truth that echoed across the valley and into the hearts of those who once laughed. The rancher they mocked had become the man they now whispered about, with awe, not scorn. Because in the unforgiving West, the rarest thing wasn't land, or gold, or even peace. It was grace, and Eli Mercer had found it. The house stood like a monument against the wild, a structure so deeply rooted in purpose it seemed the earth had lifted it up itself. The townspeople couldn't ignore it anymore. At first, they passed by on horseback, pretending not to look. Then they lingered. Then they whispered. Built it for him. What? He didn't do nothing but hide her. But deep down, they knew better. In a place where cruelty had been currency for too long, Eli had spent kindness like it would never run dry. And somehow, it had paid him back in stone and sacred timber. The sheriff returned, hat in hand this time. He asked no questions, just stared at the house, nodded once, and said, "We misjudged you." Eli didn't answer, didn't need to. He was no preacher, no lawman, no loudmouth with a cause. He'd just seen a girl dying in the dust and decided that wasn't going to be the story's end. That kind of decision didn't need explaining. It needed building. And now, behind him, stood the evidence of what could be built when mercy found its way into a man's hands. Luma flourished. Her steps became lighter, her voice stronger. She began to carve again, patterns of birds and storms and stars. She taught Eli their meanings, though half the time he said he'd rather feel them than name them. She sang while feeding the horses. She laughed with the women who returned from the hills. And one evening, under the weight of a sky blooming with orange fire, she placed her hand on Eli's chest and said, "You didn't just save me. You gave me back to myself." He couldn't speak. His throat had never felt that tight, not even during war. The tribe didn't stay forever. They weren't meant to. One by one, they left offerings, carvings, pottery, seeds, and returned to the path that had led them there. Before leaving, the eldest among them pressed a bundle into Eli's hand. Inside, a strip of cloth stained with ash and woven symbols. "Hang this," the elders said, "so your house remembers her voice when silence tries to take it again." Eli did exactly that. From that day forward, no visitor entered without passing under that cloth, and none left the same after they did. The land seemed to change too. The soil, once dry and cracked, began to yield with gentler hands. The cattle were healthier. The rains came more predictably. Some called it luck. Others called it blessing. But Eli knew what it was. When you protect something precious, something sacred, the earth remembers. And it rewards not the strong, but the righteous. In a place that once echoed with doubt and derision, the winds now carried a different story, of a man who gave when no one was watching, and who received more than he ever thought he deserved. Months passed, and life settled into something steady, something almost gentle. But in the West, peace always walked with one eye over its shoulder. One morning, a stranger rode into town, clean coat, polished boots, eyes like cold metal. He asked questions about Eli, about the girl, about the house on the edge of the valley. Said he worked for a man who claimed to own what Eli had taken. Luma's old master, a name that sent a chill through the saloon, though no one dared say it out loud. Fear, it seemed, hadn't fully left Hollow Valley. The man rode to Eli's ranch, flanked by two others. When he arrived, Luma stood in the doorway, tall, still, unshaken. Eli came out with his sleeves rolled, not a weapon in sight, just the kind of stillness that made wolves second-guess their hunger. "She was property," the man said flatly. "She still is." Eli didn't respond, just stepped between him and the house. "You're on my land," he said, voice low. "You'll leave it now." The man smirked, reached for a document. "You gonna fight paper with silence?" But before Eli could answer, Luma stepped forward. "He doesn't have to speak," she said. "I'm not property. I'm home." The moment hung like thunder about to break. Then, from the ridge behind the house, figures emerged, silent, watchful, painted in the colors of the wind. Her people had returned, not with drums, not with war, just presence. The kind of presence that could not be reasoned with or threatened. The man in the polished boots faltered, turned, left. He never came back, because what he saw in that valley was something he didn't know how to fight. Unity without fear. A bond forged in quiet defiance and sealed in something stronger than law, respect. After that, no one questioned who the land belonged to. The town's laughter stopped. The gossip dried up. And Eli, he just kept working, building more fences, digging deeper wells, planting crops that had never grown so tall. Luma began teaching children. White, native, orphaned, wild-eyed. All were welcome under her porch. She spoke of fire, of water, of the day she was seen and not saved. Because that's what Eli had done. Not claimed her, not freed her, but seen her. And in that seeing, he'd given her something the world had stolen. Choice. And so, the house on the edge of the valley became more than a home. It became a place where stories started differently. Where people weren't judged by the dust on their boots or the color of their skin, but by how gently they treated those the world had thrown away. Eli never asked for thanks. Luma never asked to be followed. But together, without meaning to, they'd planted something in the West no one could uproot. The belief that even in the hardest soil, grace could grow. In the heart of Red Rock Valley, where wind shaped the cliffs and time left its mark in stone, Eli and Luma's home stood as a beacon. Not loud, not grand, but unshakably present. Travelers began to pass through more often, drawn by stories they'd heard whispered in camps and trading posts. Some came out of curiosity, others with burdened hearts and nowhere else to turn. They were received without question. A plate of warm food, a place to rest, and a silence that made even the most restless soul feel safe. It wasn't charity, it was legacy, passed down not through blood, but through action. Luma's teachings grew. She opened a small room in the back of the house, covering the walls with animal hides where children and strangers etched drawings and marks. It wasn't a school. It was something older, something more sacred. A space where stories lived outside the mouth, where no one was asked to explain their scars, only to leave behind their truth. And the more the walls filled, the stronger the house felt. Like it wasn't just made of wood and clay, but of voices finally allowed to be heard. Eli, now with hair graying around the edges, found peace in the repetition of his days. He rose before dawn, rode the perimeter, chopped firewood, and fixed what needed fixing. But in those quiet moments, when the light first touched the porch or when Luma laughed at something small, he'd stop and let himself feel it. The stillness. The kind he never thought a man like him could earn. He didn't talk about the war anymore. He didn't need to. The land had taken those memories, softened them, buried them beneath the roots of something better. Then came a letter, delivered by a boy too young to understand its weight. It was a formal offer, money, a lot of it, from a railroad company looking to buy Eli's land. They called it strategic, called his valley essential to expansion. Eli stared at the paper while Luma watched him in silence. He folded it, placed it in the fire, and watched it curl into ash. "This land gave me back what the world tried to take," he said. "I won't sell it. I'll grow old with it." Luma said nothing, only smiled, and took his hand. That night, they lit a candle by the window. Not for fear, not for prayer, but for memory. For the girl in chains. For the rancher who had nothing, but chose to give anyway. For the tribe who built with their hands what others tried to burn with words. And for everyone still out there, wondering if the West had any good left in it. That single flame flickered against the darkness like a heartbeat, like a promise. That no matter how wide the desert stretched, this place, this story, would remain untouched. Time continued its slow march, measured not by clocks but by harvests, storms, and stars. Children who once etched drawings on Luma's walls returned years later with children of their own. They came bearing small gifts, stones, feathers, bits of woven cloth. Each one found a home on the mantle, not for decoration, but for remembrance. Because Eli and Luma had taught something the West had nearly forgotten, that the smallest gestures, when made with truth, echo far longer than the loudest guns. One summer, the valley faced a drought. The crops wilted, the creek thinned, and the cattle moaned in the night. The town grew anxious. Tempers flared. But on Eli's land, no one panicked. He dug deeper. Luma gathered herbs and taught others how to store water, like her people had done long before fences carved the land. And when the first clouds finally returned, it rained hardest over their land, like the sky hadn't forgotten who had honored the earth when others only took from it. That same season, a boy arrived alone, barefoot, dusty, eyes hollow. He never said his name, but he sat by the fire, and Luma wrapped a blanket around his shoulders without asking a single question. For weeks, he didn't speak, just followed Eli around, watched how he moved, how he listened, how he worked without demanding. Then, one day, the boy looked up and said, "Can I stay?" Eli didn't answer with words. He just handed the boy a hammer. From that moment on, another story was folded into the house's walls, one of quiet adoption, of healing without labels. As seasons shifted again, so did Eli's body. He walked slower, needed help lifting fence posts. His hands, once rough and sure, now trembled when the cold came early. But never once did he complain, because everything he had given had returned to him in ways he never expected. In the faces of the children, in the rhythm of Luma's voice, in the fire that never had to burn alone. When the town doctor came to visit, Eli simply said, "I've got more behind me than ahead, and that's all right. Some men die with gold. I'll die with peace." And as the leaves turned red and gold, and the sun dipped earlier each day behind the canyon walls, Luma sat with Eli on the porch, his blanket tucked around his shoulders. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The house behind them creaked gently, alive with stories, laughter, footsteps, and quiet. It was no longer just a house. It was a testament that in a world that once mocked mercy, one man had chosen it anyway, and in doing so, changed everything. Winter came with a softness that year, as if even the wind had learned to walk gently near their home. Snow dusted the rooftops, blanketed the fence lines, and muffled every step like a hymn. Inside, the house glowed with warmth, firelight dancing across wooden beams carved with the stories of those who had passed through. Eli spent more time in his chair, a blanket over his knees, his gaze often lost in the flicker of flames. Luma stayed close, reading aloud, singing low songs that carried the rhythm of the earth itself. Outside, the valley slept, but inside, something sacred kept breathing. On the eve of the solstice, people began to arrive, one by one, carrying bundles, food, and silence. No invitations had been sent. None were needed. They simply came, those who had been helped, those who had once been strangers, now family by spirit. They filled the house, sat on the floor, stood in the doorways. Luma prepared stew. Eli, quiet but present, nodded to each face with a glint of recognition. It wasn't a farewell. It was a gathering of echoes, of every life touched by a decision made long ago beside a dying fire and a chain girl. A young woman approached Eli that night, the daughter of a man who had once tried to drive Luma out of town. She knelt beside his chair, tears in her eyes. "I used to be afraid of this house," she whispered. "Now I tell my children it's where courage lives." Eli, too tired to speak, reached for her hand and squeezed it once. She understood. Because some truths don't need to be said, they just need to be felt. Around them, laughter mingled with memory, and the walls, those sacred walls, held every sound like scripture. As the fire burned low, Loomis stood before the gathering and spoke for the first time of that night, of the chains, of the silence, of Eli's choice. Her voice did not tremble. She told the story not with sorrow, but with strength. "He didn't rescue me," she said. "He chose to see me. And in that moment, I became more than what they tried to make of me. And so did he." No one moved, not even the wind outside. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever needed to be seen, and to everyone who had dared to see. That night, when the stars returned and the house finally grew quiet, Eli fell asleep in his chair, a peaceful breath leaving his lips like the last note of a hymn. Luma didn't wake him. She just sat beside him, her hand in his, and whispered, "You kept your promise." Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside, something eternal had been planted. Not a monument, not a legacy, something far deeper. A truth passed from soul to soul, like fire passed hand to hand in the dark. In the spring that followed, Luma opened the house fully. Not just to guests or neighbors, but to all. The doors stayed open from sunrise to sundown. Children came to read, to draw, to ask questions about the man whose portrait now hung above the hearth, a quiet image of Eli, carved by a boy who once couldn't speak. People brought stories, heirlooms, seeds. Some came to grieve, others to give, and no one left unchanged. The house had become something rare in the West, a place where time paused and truth was never punished. Word of it spread far beyond the valley. Riders came from distant towns, hoping to glimpse what they'd only heard in rumors. The house built by a tribe, kept alive by a woman once enslaved, and preserved by a man who never wanted to be a hero. They found no gold, no relics, only warmth, bread, and the unmistakable presence of a life well lived. They stayed for hours, sometimes days, and when they left, they did so with lighter hearts and heavier thoughts, because something about the place made them question who they were, and who they still could be. One afternoon, a schoolteacher arrived with a group of young boys. She asked Luma if she would tell them the story of the house. Luma nodded, knelt to their level, and said, "Once a man chose kindness when it cost him everything, and in return, he was given more than the world thought he deserved." One boy raised his hand and asked, "Did he regret it?" Luma smiled, placed a hand over her heart, and said, "He regretted not doing it sooner." That answer lingered in the room long after the children had gone. Luma kept tending the land, kept teaching, kept carving stories into the beams of the house. And with every new mark, she honored not just Eli, but every soul who had passed through, carrying wounds they thought would never heal. The house never changed hands, never aged in spirit. And in time, it became more than shelter. It became a symbol, a reminder that the West wasn't only forged in bullets and betrayal, but also in silent acts of bravery, in one man's choice to see worth where others saw shame. And so, as the valley grew greener and the skies stretched wider, the house remained, not because of fame or fortune or bloodlines, but because it was built on something the wind could not carry away. It was built on mercy, on courage, on the belief that one life, when treated with dignity, can echo through generations. And in that echo, a rancher and a girl built something stronger than law, louder than laughter, and far more lasting than stone. Years passed, and the house on the edge of the valley became a landmark, yet not in the way towns mark battlefields or old graves. It lived. It breathed. It welcomed. Travelers who had never known Eli came and knelt beside his chair, still in its place by the hearth, as if his spirit remained seated, watching, listening. Some left behind trinkets, a coin, a scrap of cloth, a note of thanks. Luma kept every one, tucking them into a cedar box carved with the symbol of the rising sun. That box wasn't treasure, it was testimony. The boy Eli had handed a hammer to all those winters ago now stood tall, shoulders broad with the strength of the land. He took care of the fences, repaired the roof after storms, and read Eli's old journal every week like it was gospel. Luma trusted him with the land, not because he had earned it, but because he had honored it. He never tried to own the story. He only carried it forward, quietly, respectfully, and without pride. That's how Eli would have wanted it. One day, a woman came, a historian from back east, polished boots, pen always scratching. She asked questions with good intention, but a hardened heart. What made Eli do it? She pressed. What made him risk everything for someone he didn't even know? Luma thought for a long time before answering. Because he remembered what it felt like to have no one, she said. And because when the world gives you a chance to break the cycle, you either take it or become part of the problem. The historian nodded, but the weight of the answer seemed too heavy for a notebook to hold. Later that evening, as the sun bled orange behind the hills, Luma sat alone by the fire. The house creaked gently around her, as if settling into memory. She pulled out Eli's coat, still hanging where he left it, and ran her hands along its seams. You never wanted to be remembered, she whispered. But you are. She smiled, not out of sorrow, but out of the kind of peace only the righteous ever get to carry. And outside, the valley listened, because it always had. Ever since the day one man said yes to the quiet voice that told him, do what's right. That spring, wildflowers bloomed thick across the edge of the ranch, covering the old trail where Eli had first carried Luma home. They weren't planted. They just came, like the land was remembering too. Travelers walking the path often stopped to touch them, to breathe them in. And each time, they asked the same question, what happened here? And those who knew the truth always answered the same way. Mercy did. Because in the end, that's what the story had always been about. Mercy, not given because it was deserved, but because someone was brave enough to offer it anyway. When Luma's final day came, it was quiet, just as she had lived. She sat at her favorite spot by the window, wrapped in a woven shawl passed down from her mother's line. The sky outside stretched blue and soft, the hills humming with the sound of wind and memory. She closed her eyes not with fear, but with fullness. Her story had been written into the walls, the soil, the people. Nothing left undone, nothing left unsaid. The house would keep her voice, just as it had kept Eli's, in every creak of the floor, every breath of wind through the doorframe. The valley mourned not with noise, but with reverence. People came barefoot, hands open, hearts heavy. No funeral was held, only a circle beneath the tree Eli had planted decades ago. The boy now man read aloud from the journal. She taught us how to listen, not just to people, but to silence. That's where the truth lives. A little girl placed a single sunflower at the base of the tree. No one moved it. It remained there, season after season, untouched by storms, as if guarded by something beyond nature. In time, the house passed into the care of many hands. No one claimed to own it. They simply lived by its example. It became a place where the broken found rest, where the lost found direction, and where the hardened remembered how to be soft again. New names were etched into the beams, not over the old ones, but beside them. Because legacy, when built right, isn't replaced, it's continued. Just like Eli once passed a hammer to a boy, and Luma once passed a story to the world. 100 years later, a child born far from the dust of the West reads about the rancher and the girl in a book, touches the page, and asks, "Did that really happen?" And the elder beside them smiles gently and says, "Not only did it happen, it still is." Because the truth of what Eli and Luma created can't be buried in time. It doesn't rot. It doesn't fade. It grows. Every time someone chooses kindness when it costs them. Every time someone protects a life instead of punishing it. Every time someone builds instead of burns. And so the West, in all its dust and legend, holds one story above the rest. Not the one with the most bullets or blood, but the one with the most grace. The story of a man who was mocked for saving a girl, and was repaid, not in gold, but in stone, in silence, and in love. A house was built, a life was rebuilt, and a world, just a little, was changed, not by force, but by mercy, passed from hand to hand like fire in the dark. And it still burns. The story of Eli Mercer and Luma is more than a tale from the dusty pages of the Old West. It's a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and the quiet strength it takes to stand for what is right when no one else will. Eli was mocked, doubted, and isolated for choosing mercy over fear, yet his choice rippled beyond the ranch, beyond the valley, shaping a legacy built not of steel or stone, but of unwavering humanity. And Luma, once bound in chains and silence, became the heartbeat of that legacy, a reminder that freedom begins with being seen, and that healing is born in courage shared. Their journey teaches us that true bravery is not the loud clash of guns, but the steadfast refusal to turn away from injustice. It is found in small, daily decisions, offering shelter when others shutter their doors, standing up for the vulnerable even when the price is high, and building a home in a world eager to tear things down. The house her tribe built for Eli was more than shelter. It was a symbol that when kindness meets resilience, it can transform not only lives but entire communities. This story challenges us to ask ourselves, in the moments when the world expects us to look away, will we choose to stand? When it seems easier to be indifferent, can we find the strength to protect, to nurture, to love without condition? Because the legacy Eli and Luma left behind is a call to action, proof that even one person's choice can ignite change that echoes through generations. Their lives remind us that grace is not weakness, but the greatest form of power. As the dust settles on their tale, we are left with a profound truth. Mercy is the foundation upon which hope is built. And hope, once kindled, can endure every storm, every mockery, every shadow cast by fear. Eli's choice to save a girl no one else cared for became a beacon, a light that continues to guide those willing to see beyond themselves and into the humanity of others. That is the real frontier, the one we face every day. If this story touched your heart and stirred something inside, join us on this journey. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the hidden depths of courage and kindness. Like this video if you believe that standing for what's right, even when alone, is the bravest act of all. And share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were Eli Mercer, faced with the choice to save a life no one else would? Your voice matters. Let it be heard.